Good evening. Tonight we descend into the story of a white crystalline powder that promised relief and delivered catastrophe. A substance synthesized in the laboratories of post-war Germany, marketed in amber bottles alongside aspirin, proclaimed completely safe for everyone. Pregnant women, nursing mothers, even children. The doctors called it a wonder drug, a sedative without side effects, a solution to anxiety, insomnia, the nausea of early pregnancy. Within 5 years, it would be sold in 46 countries under 37 different names. Within 5 years, over 10,000 babies would be born with limbs that ended at their shoulders, with hands growing directly from their torsos, with flipper-like appendages where arms should have been. The medical community would call them seal babies, the condition phocomelia, the cause a drug called Thalidomide. This is not a story of accident or unavoidable tragedy. This is a story of warnings ignored, of science corrupted, of corporate ambition placed above human life. Before we continue with this exploration, if this type of content resonates with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Now, let us begin in 1954, in a pharmaceutical laboratory in West Germany, where two chemists were about to create one of medicine's greatest disasters. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was transforming West Germany in the years following the war. Cities rose from rubble. Factories hummed back to life. Among the industries finding their footing was pharmaceuticals, and in the town of Stolberg, nestled in the Rhineland near Aachen, a company called Chemie Grünenthal was carving out its place in this new order. The company had been founded in 1946 by Hermann Wirtz Sr., a businessman whose previous ventures included the family's soap-making operation, Meurer and Wirtz. Wirtz was a former member of the Nazi Party, a detail that would later seem less coincidental than it appeared at the time. In the Saarjäger, immediate post-war period, when the Allied Control Council had lifted its ban on German pharmaceutical production, Wirtz saw opportunity. The country desperately needed antibiotics. Penicillin, that miraculous mold-derived drug that had saved countless lives during the war, was in short supply. Grünenthal became the first German company to bring penicillin to market in the post-war era, and the profits were substantial. It was a promising start for a company that would, within a decade, achieve worldwide infamy. But Grünenthal's ambitions extended beyond antibiotics. The company sought to develop its own proprietary drugs, compounds that could be patented and marketed globally. To lead this effort, they needed someone with expertise, someone who understood drug development, someone who could deliver results. They found Heinrich Müchter. Dr. Müchter's credentials were impressive on paper. He had specialized in typhus research during the war, working to develop vaccines at a time when outbreaks of the disease ravaged both military and civilian populations. Typhus culture cannot survive outside a living host, a fact that presented certain logistical challenges for vaccine development. The solution during wartime was to inject the disease into human subjects, prisoners in concentration camps, and then use these infected individuals to test potential vaccines. Müchter's experiments had reportedly been conducted at Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and the Krakow ghetto. Hundreds of prisoners died in the course of this research. After the war, the Polish authorities sought him for war crimes, but Müchter had been captured by American forces. Rather than face trial, he found his way to Chemie Grünenthal, where his expertise was welcomed and his past quietly overlooked. He was not the only man with such a history at Grünenthal. The company's advisory board included Dr. Otto Ambros, a chemist of considerable renown and even more considerable notoriety. Ambros had been one of the 4 inventors of sarin, the nerve gas that would later become infamous in its own right. He had served as Hitler's advisor on chemical warfare. During the war, he had been a senior figure at E.G. Farben, the chemical conglomerate that manufactured Zyklon B for use in the gas chambers. Ambros had established a forced labor camp at Die Herrnfurth to produce nerve gases, and later had overseen the construction of the Auschwitz-Monowitz chemical factory, where synthetic rubber and oil were produced by slave labor. At the Nuremberg trials in 1948, Ambros was convicted of mass murder and enslavement. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He served less than that. By the time thalidomide was being developed and marketed, Ambros was free, and he sat on Grünenthal's advisory committee, lending his expertise to the company's pharmaceutical ambitions. There were others. Dr. Ernst Günther Schenk, a nutrition expert responsible for many deaths in the camps, found refuge at Grünenthal, though apparently not involved directly in the thalidomide program. Dr. Heinz Baumkörter, the chief medical officer at Sachsenhausen concentration camp, had been sentenced to life imprisonment by the Soviets, only to be released in 1956 and given work at Grünenthal. The company, it seemed, was a haven for men whose wartime activities might have made employment elsewhere difficult. This was the environment. This was the culture in which thalidomide was born. In March of 1954, 2 chemists working under Mückter's direction were attempting to develop new medications. Wilhelm Kunz, Mückter's assistant, and Dr. Herbert Keller, a pharmacologist, were working with various chemical compounds, seeking something with sedative properties. The pharmaceutical market for sedatives was robust. Anxiety, insomnia, nervous tension. These were conditions that affected millions, and existing treatments often came with significant side effects. Barbiturates could be addictive and dangerous in overdose. Other sedatives caused grogginess and impaired function. There was demand for something better. What Kunz isolated was a byproduct of their other work, a compound that Keller recognized as similar in structure to glutathione, an existing sedative. They refined it, modified it, and in March 1954, they had their result, a white crystalline powder, chemical formula C13H10N2O4, molecular weight 258.23. They called it thalidomide. The name itself was derived from its chemical structure, phthalimidoglutamide, shortened and smoothed into something pronounceable, marketable. It was, from the beginning, conceived as a product, not merely as a compound for study. Early testing was encouraging, at least by the standards they chose to apply. Thalidomide was administered to various laboratory animals, mice, rats, guinea pigs. The researchers were looking for the LD50, the lethal dose at which 50% of test subjects would die. This was standard toxicology practice, a way to establish the safety margins of a new drug. What they found was remarkable. They could not find the LD50. No matter how much thalidomide they gave the animals, they could not induce a lethal overdose. The mice did not die. The rats did not die. The animals might become drowsy, lethargic, but they survived. This was interpreted as proof of the drug's safety. If you could not kill a mouse with it, surely you could not harm a human. The logic seemed sound. The conclusion seemed obvious. Thalidomide was, by this measure, essentially non-toxic. What they did not test, what no one thought to test, was the drug's effect on reproduction, on fetal development, on the process of gestation. The prevailing medical wisdom of the time held that the placental barrier protected the developing fetus from harmful substances in the mother's bloodstream. The placenta was understood as a filter, a guardian, allowing nutrients through while blocking toxins and pathogens. It had been observed that some infections could cross this barrier, syphilis for instance, but the general assumption was that most drugs could not. Therefore, testing drugs on pregnant animals was not standard practice. It was not considered necessary. This assumption would prove catastrophic. In April of 1954, Grünenthal acquired a 20-year patent on thalidomide. The company now had exclusive rights to manufacture and market this compound, and the clock was ticking. Patents expire, and every month of development was a month of lost revenue. There was pressure to move quickly from laboratory to market. The company began clinical trials, though the term trials perhaps suggests more rigor than actually existed. Doctors were given samples and asked to prescribe them to patients, to observe the effects, to report back. There were no control groups, no standardized protocols, no systematic data collection. The reports that came back were largely anecdotal. Patients slept well. They felt less anxious. They reported few side effects. This was considered sufficient evidence of efficacy. In November of 1956, Grünenthal introduced its first thalidomide-based product to the market. It was called Grip-X, marketed as a treatment for respiratory infections, colds, flu, coughs. The formulation combined thalidomide with quinine, vitamin C, phenacetin, and acetylsalicylic acid, aspirin. It was sold over the counter, no prescription required. The reasoning was that thalidomide would help patients sleep, allowing the body to heal, while the other ingredients addressed the symptoms of illness. Whether this combination was effective is unclear. What is clear is that it began putting thalidomide into the bodies of German citizens, and the company began observing its effects in the real world. Among those effects was something unexpected, and to the company's researchers, quite promising. Several doctors reported that thalidomide was particularly effective at reducing nausea. Pregnant women who took it for colds or insomnia found that their morning sickness, that near universal affliction of early pregnancy, was greatly diminished or eliminated entirely. This was valuable information. Morning sickness affected millions of women. Existing treatments were limited and often ineffective. A drug that could safely relieve this misery would be a commercial triumph. No trials were conducted on pregnant women. No studies were undertaken to determine whether thalidomide might pose any risk to a developing fetus. The clinical use simply happened organically, as doctors prescribed it, and pregnant patients took it and reported relief. On Christmas Day, 1956, a baby was born in Germany with severe birth defects. The child's limbs were malformed, the arms shortened, the internal organs improperly developed. The mother was an employee of Chemie Grünenthal. She had taken thalidomide during her pregnancy. This was the first known victim, the first of thousands. The company's response to this case, if there was any response, remains unknown. No public acknowledgement was made. No investigation appears to have been launched. Perhaps it was dismissed as coincidence, as one of those tragic anomalies that occur in a small percentage of births. Perhaps it was deliberately suppressed. The records are incomplete, the truth obscured by time and the company's later efforts to control the narrative. What is certain is that thalidomide's development continued uninterrupted. By 1957, Grunenthal had refined its strategy. GripX had proven moderately successful, but the real opportunity lay in marketing thalidomide on its own as a dedicated sedative. On October 1st, 1957, the company launched a new product, Contergan. This was pure thalidomide, sold in tablets of various dosages, marketed directly as a treatment for anxiety, tension, and insomnia. The advertising campaign was aggressive and unequivocal. Contergan was safe. Contergan had no dangerous side effects. Contergan could be taken by anyone, adults, children, the elderly, and crucially, Contergan was safe for pregnant women. The advertisements featured peaceful imagery, sleeping infants, calm mothers, restful nights. The text made bold claims. One advertisement declared that Contergan was completely non-toxic and could be given to children without concern. Another stated that even in cases of attempted suicide, individuals taking massive overdoses, no fatalities had occurred. This was presented as proof of absolute safety, a drug so benign that even deliberate misuse could not cause harm. Contergan was sold over the counter. In pharmacies across West Germany, you could walk in and purchase it as easily as aspirin. No prescription was needed. No doctor's oversight was required. The white crystalline powder in amber bottles became a household item, a routine presence in medicine cabinets, a solution to the ordinary anxieties and sleeplessness of modern life. Within months, Contergan was a commercial success. Germans were consuming the drug by the millions of doses. Other pharmaceutical companies took notice. If Grunenthal had developed something this profitable, they wanted a share of it. Licensing agreements were negotiated. By the mid-1950s, 14 pharmaceutical companies had acquired rights to manufacture and market thalidomide under their own brand names in their own territories. The white crystalline powder began its journey across borders. In the United Kingdom, it would be called Distaval. In Australia, also Distaval. In Canada, Kevadon. In dozens of countries, under dozens of names, the same drug spread, carried by the same promise. Complete safety, perfect relief, no side effects. The doctors prescribed it. The patients took it. The pregnant women, grateful for anything that might ease their nausea, accepted the prescriptions and swallowed the tablets. In those amber bottles, in those white pills, was something that would reshape medicine, shatter trust, and leave a legacy of suffering that endures to this day. But in 1957, none of this was known. In 1957, thalidomide was a wonder drug, a triumph of German pharmaceutical innovation, a gift to a world still healing from war. The men who made it, the men with their histories, their experiments, their willingness to overlook inconvenient questions, were on the path to wealth and recognition. The cost would be paid by others, by mothers who trusted their doctors, by infants who never had a choice, by families who would spend lifetimes navigating a world not built for the bodies thalidomide had created. The white crystalline powder was spreading now, moving through channels of commerce and medical practice, multiplying in medicine cabinets and hospital formularies. And in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in Australia and Canada and across Europe, women were becoming pregnant, and they were taking their medicine, and inside them, in the darkness of the womb, something was going terribly, catastrophically wrong. The expansion of thalidomide across the globe occurred with remarkable speed. By the late 1950s, the drug had become one of the most widely distributed pharmaceuticals in the world, a testament both to its perceived effectiveness and to the efficiency of international pharmaceutical commerce. What had begun in a laboratory in Stolberg, Germany, was now appearing in pharmacies from London to Sydney, from Tokyo to Sao Paulo. The white powder that couldn't kill a laboratory mouse was being consumed by millions of human beings, and the consequences were beginning to manifest in ways that should have raised immediate alarm. In the United Kingdom, the distribution rights had been acquired by the distillers' company Biochemicals Limited, a subsidiary of Distillers Company Limited, better known for producing whiskey and gin. The company saw opportunity in pharmaceuticals and had established a division specifically for this purpose. Their factory in Liverpool had been built during the war to produce penicillin, and now it would manufacture thalidomide under the trade name Distaval. The British marketing campaign mirrored the German approach, though perhaps with even greater boldness. Advertisements appeared in medical journals, in pharmacies, in promotional materials distributed to doctors. One particularly striking advertisement featured the image of a peaceful, sleeping child alongside text that read, "Distaval can be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers without adverse effect on mother or child." The advertisement continued, "Outstandingly safe, Distaval has been prescribed for nearly 3 years in this country." Complete safety. These were the words that appeared repeatedly in the marketing materials. Not generally safe or safe when used as directed, but complete safety. Absolute safety, the kind of claim that left no room for doubt, no space for caution. Doctors reading these advertisements, trusting in the regulatory systems that were supposed to vet such claims, prescribed Distaval freely. To pregnant women suffering morning sickness, to nursing mothers dealing with anxiety and sleeplessness, to anyone seeking relief from the ordinary tensions of daily life. Australia and New Zealand received the same product under the same name, marketed by the same company through its international distribution network. In Canada, it arrived as Kevadon, in France as Softenon, in Japan as Isomide, in Italy as Softenon and Neurosedin, in Spain as Softenon and Enterosedative. Each country, each market received thalidomide under different names, but with the same promises, the same assurances of safety. By the end of the 1950s, thalidomide was being sold in 46 countries. Some sources suggest the number of trade names reached 51, though 37 is the more commonly cited figure. Regardless of the exact count, the scale was enormous. Pharmaceutical companies across the globe had licensed the drug from Chemie Grünenthal, eager to capture their share of what appeared to be a lucrative and rapidly growing market. West Germany remained the largest consumer. By 1960, Germans were taking approximately 1 million doses of Contergan per day. 1 million doses daily in a nation still rebuilding from war, still processing trauma, still seeking stability and rest. The drug had become woven into the fabric of daily life, as common as aspirin, as trusted as any medicine available without prescription. The American market, however, remained tantalizingly out of reach for Grünenthal. The United States was the largest and most profitable pharmaceutical market in the world, and penetrating it was the goal of every drug manufacturer with international ambitions. In 1958, Chemie Grünenthal entered negotiations with the William S. Merrell Company, based in Cincinnati, Ohio. Merrell was an established American pharmaceutical firm with distribution networks across the country and experience navigating the regulatory requirements of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. The partnership seemed ideal. Merrell would handle the American introduction of thalidomide under the brand name Kevadon, and both companies would profit handsomely. But Merrell faced a problem. The FDA required approval before any new drug could be marketed in the United States, and the approval process required data, clinical trial data, safety data, evidence of efficacy. Grunenthal provided what information they had, but it was limited and largely anecdotal. American regulators, even in the less stringent environment of the late 1950s, expected more rigorous documentation. Rather than conduct the lengthy and expensive trials that might satisfy the FDA's requirements, Merrell chose a different approach. Beginning in 1959, the company launched what they termed clinical trials, but which were in reality an unregulated mass distribution of the drug. Sales representatives, called detail men in the industry, were given samples of Kevadon and instructed to distribute them to doctors across the country. More than 1,000 physicians participated in this program. These doctors were provided with Kevadon in various formulations, various dosages, various colors, packaged in unmarked envelopes or bottles with minimal labeling. They were encouraged to prescribe it to their patients and to observe the results. The scale of this operation was staggering. Millions of pills were distributed. Approximately 20,000 American patients received Kevadon through this program, and among them were at least 600 pregnant women. No systematic records were kept of who received the drug, in what quantity, for what condition, with what results. The distribution was essentially uncontrolled, the monitoring essentially non-existent. The detail men pitched Kevadon as a safe sedative suitable for anyone, including pregnant women suffering from morning sickness. Doctors, trusting in the representations made by a reputable pharmaceutical company, prescribed it accordingly. Cincinnati, as the home of the Merrell Company, became ground zero for this distribution. Ohio families, Ohio pregnant women, Ohio infants would bear a disproportionate share of the American toll, though the true numbers would never be fully known. In September of 1960, Richardson Merrell, the company had recently merged and taken a new name, formally submitted an application to the FDO requesting approval to market Kevadon throughout the United States. The application landed on the desk of a medical officer named Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey. It was one of her first assignments at the agency. She had been hired just 1 month earlier, but while the American story was beginning across the Atlantic and in Germany itself, warning signs were already appearing. These were not subtle indications. They were clear, documented, repeated warnings that something was seriously wrong with thalidomide. The first warning had come as early as 1956, just as Grunenthal was beginning its commercial rollout of the drug. A doctor in Berlin had reported to the company that thalidomide was showing absolute intolerability in some patients. The side effects he described were concerning enough that he felt compelled to alert the manufacturer. Grunenthal's response was dismissive. The company informed the doctor that he must have been administering improper doses. The problem, they suggested, was with his prescribing practices, not with their drug. No further investigation was conducted. The warning was filed away and forgotten. In 1957, a researcher at Edinburgh University in Scotland conducted studies on thalidomide's effects on thyroid function. His findings were troubling. The drug appeared to inhibit thyroid activity in ways that could have serious health consequences. He concluded that the use of thalidomide was unjustifiable in the absence of more detailed study of its long-term effects. This research was shared with pharmaceutical companies marketing the drug in the UK. The response, if any, was inadequate. The drug remained on the market, the warnings unheeded. By late 1959, a new and disturbing pattern was emerging in the medical reports, reaching pharmaceutical companies and regulatory authorities. Patients who had been taking thalidomide for extended periods, weeks or months, were developing a condition called peripheral neuritis. The symptoms began as tingling or numbness in the extremities, a prickling sensation in the hands and feet, as if they had fallen asleep. But unlike the temporary numbness that comes from restricted blood flow, this sensation did not fade. Instead, it progressed. The tingling became burning. The numbness became painful. Patients reported sensations of stabbing, of fire running through their nerves, of profound discomfort that interfered with sleep, with work, with the basic activities of daily life. Dr. A. Leslie Florence, a British physician, documented 4 cases among his own patients. In December of 1960, he published a letter in the British Medical Journal describing the condition. He wrote, "3 of the patients have now received no thalidomide for 2 to 3 months, and there has been a marked improvement in their symptoms, but they are still present. It would appear that these symptoms could possibly be a toxic effect of thalidomide." The significance of this observation cannot be overstated. Peripheral neuritis indicated that thalidomide was capable of causing nerve damage. It was affecting the nervous system. It was, contrary to all the marketing claims, demonstrably toxic to human tissue. If it could damage the nerves in an adult's hands and feet, what might it do to the developing nervous system of an embryo? The reports multiplied throughout 1960. More doctors observed peripheral neuritis in their patients. More letters appeared in medical journals. More concerns were raised with pharmaceutical companies. Grunenthal's response was to add warnings to the packaging. In Germany, the package inserts for Contergan were updated to mention the possibility of prickling and a sensation of numbness in the hands and slash or feet. In May of 1961, the company applied to make Contergan available by prescription only, rather than over-the-counter, citing these reports of nerve damage. But the drug remained on the market. Doctors continued to prescribe it, patients continued to take it, and pregnant women, unaware of any risk, continued to consume thalidomide for their morning sickness, believing they were taking something completely safe, something that had been tested and approved and marketed as harmless. Meanwhile, in hospitals and clinics across Germany, across the United Kingdom, across Australia, and every country where thalidomide was sold, doctors were beginning to notice something unprecedented and profoundly disturbing. They were seeing babies born with severe deformities. Not occasionally, not as rare anomalies, but with increasing frequency. Babies whose arms ended at the shoulder, babies whose hands grew directly from their torsos, babies with legs that were mere stumps, with feet attached directly to the hips, babies with seal-like flippers instead of limbs. The medical term for this condition was phocomelia, derived from the Greek words for seal and limb. It was known to exist, but it was extraordinarily rare, perhaps one case in several million births. Before 1958, most obstetricians would go their entire careers without encountering a single case of phocomelia. But beginning in 1958, the incidence began to rise dramatically. By 1960, clinics in Germany were seeing multiple cases per month. By 1961, the numbers were exponential. The medical community struggled to explain this epidemic. Some doctors, noting the timing, the late 1950s, when nuclear weapons testing was at its peak, speculated that radioactive fallout might be responsible. In May of 1958, a pediatrician named Carl Beck published an article in a German newspaper suggesting that nuclear tests were causing the disabilities. The theory seemed plausible. Radiation was known to cause mutations to damage developing cells. The public was already anxious about fallout, about strontium-90 in milk, about the invisible contamination drifting across continents. Blaming nuclear testing fit the fears of the era. But some doctors were not convinced. They were seeing patterns that didn't align with radiation exposure. The deformities were too specific, too consistent. Radiation damage would be more random, more varied. What they were seeing suggested a teratogen, a specific substance that interfered with fetal development during a specific window of time. One of these doctors was Widukind Lenz, a German pediatrician and geneticist working in Hamburg. Lenz was methodical and careful, trained in the rigorous analysis of genetic patterns and developmental anomalies. As the cases multiplied in his clinic and in hospitals across Germany, he began investigating systematically. He reviewed medical records, he interviewed mothers, he looked for common factors, environmental exposures, medications, illnesses, occupations, diets, anything that might link these cases together. At the same time and independently, another doctor was conducting a similar investigation on the other side of the world. Dr. William McBride was an Australian obstetrician working at Crown Street Women's Hospital in Sydney. McBride had helped popularize thalidomide in Australia as a treatment for morning sickness, prescribing it regularly to his pregnant patients. He had believed, as he had been told by the pharmaceutical representatives, that it was completely safe. But now, among his own patients, he was seeing a disturbing number of babies born with severe malformations. The rate was far too high to be coincidence. 1 in 5 of the women who had taken thalidomide during pregnancy were giving birth to babies with defects. It was a midwife at the hospital, Sister Pat Sparrow, who first voiced suspicion. She had noticed the pattern before McBride had seen the same drug name appearing in the medical histories of the affected mothers. She brought her concerns to McBride, and he began his own investigation. In Germany, another father was refusing to accept official explanations. Karl Hermann Schulte-Hillen's son had been born with stumps instead of arms, a devastating malformation that doctors attributed to unknown causes, perhaps nuclear fallout, perhaps simple misfortune. Schulte-Hillen was not satisfied with these answers. He wanted to know what had harmed his son. He wanted accountability. He began his own investigation, and he found an ally in Dr. Widukind Lenz. Together, Schulte-Hillen and Lenz placed advertisements in several German newspapers. They were seeking information from other families who had given birth to children with similar deformities. They asked mothers to contact them, to share their medical histories, to help them identify any common factors. The responses came quickly, and they revealed a pattern that was unmistakable. Nearly every mother who responded reported taking thalidomide during pregnancy. The connection was there, undeniable and damning. The drug that had been marketed as completely safe was causing catastrophic birth defects. Lenz compiled his data and prepared to present his findings to Chemie Grünenthal. The company's response when it came was not gratitude for the discovery or concern for public health. According to later allegations, Grünenthal threatened Lenz with legal action if he published his findings. The company disputed his conclusions, questioned his methodology, challenged his data. They had billions of Deutsche Marks at stake, a reputation to protect, a global market to preserve. But by late 1961, the evidence was overwhelming. McBride in Australia and Lenz in Germany had independently reached the same conclusion through different investigations on opposite sides of the planet. The convergence of their findings left no room for doubt. Thalidomide was a teratogen. It crossed the placental barrier that doctors had believed was impenetrable. It interfered with fetal development during a critical window, approximately days 20 to 36 after conception, during the period when limbs and organs were forming. The drug that had been deemed non-toxic because it could not kill laboratory mice was in fact profoundly toxic to developing human embryos. The timing of exposure determined the specific deformities. If a woman took thalidomide around day 20 of her pregnancy, counting from conception, the drug might damage the developing brain. Around day 22, the ears and face were forming. Thalidomide exposure at this point could result in malformed or absent ears, facial abnormalities. Day 24 was when the arms were developing. Day 28, the legs. The window was narrow but devastating. A woman might take a single dose, a single tablet to ease her nausea, and that single dose, taken at precisely the wrong moment in her pregnancy, could ensure that her child would be born without arms. And thalidomide was being taken by pregnant women in massive numbers, in 46 countries, in millions of doses, under dozens of brand names. The scale of the disaster was becoming apparent, and the toll, the true human toll, was only beginning to be counted. In medicine cabinets across the developed world, in pharmacies and hospitals and clinics, the amber bottles sat on shelves. The white crystalline powder waited in tablets and capsules. The prescriptions were written. The pills were swallowed. And in the darkness of the womb, in that space medicine had believed was protected, was sacred, was safe, the catastrophe continued to unfold. Limbs that should have formed failed to form. Organs that should have developed properly developed incorrectly. Children who should have been born whole were born irreparably damaged. The warning signs had been there. The nerve damage, the reports from Edinburgh. The first malformed baby born to a Grünenthal employee on Christmas Day 1956. The evidence had accumulated, had been documented, had been reported to the manufacturers. But the drug had remained on the market. The marketing had continued. The promises of complete safety had been repeated until they became accepted truth. And now, as 1961 drew toward its close, the magnitude of what had been done was beginning to force itself into public consciousness, into medical awareness, into the horrified recognition of a profession that had failed in its most fundamental duty. First, do no harm. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the offices of the United States Food and Drug Administration in Washington, D.C., a single woman stood between America and the catastrophe that was unfolding in Europe. She did not know, when the application first crossed her desk in September of 1960, that she would become a hero. She did not know that her name would be spoken with reverence, that presidents would honor her, that her decision to simply do her job thoroughly would spare thousands of American families from unspeakable grief. She knew only that something about the application troubled her, and she was not willing to approve it until her concerns were addressed. Her name was Frances Oldham Kelsey, and her story begins long before thalidomide, in a childhood that shaped the qualities that would later define her career. She was born Frances Kathleen Oldham on July 24th, 1914, in the small community of Cobble Hill on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Her father was Australian, her mother Scottish, and young Frances, called Frankie throughout her life, grew up in rural Canada with a fierce independence and an early fascination with science. She learned to read by listening to her mother teach her older brother, and she excelled in her studies with a determination that was remarkable even then. She graduated from high school at age 15, an achievement that spoke both to her intelligence and to the relative lack of educational resources in rural British Columbia, where students often progressed at whatever pace they could manage. At McGill University in Montreal, she earned her Bachelor of Science degree in 1934 at the age of 20, hoping to pursue laboratory work. But this was the height of the Great Depression, and jobs for women in science were scarce. The future seemed uncertain. Then came an opportunity that would change the trajectory of her life. The University of Chicago offered her a position as a research assistant, and she accepted, moving to the United States to work under the mentorship of Dr. Eugene Gehling, a renowned pharmacologist. There was an amusing misunderstanding at the start. The university's offer letter had been addressed to Mr. F. Oldham, the administrators apparently assuming that someone named Frances must be male. By the time they discovered their error, Kelsey had already accepted and made arrangements to move. Rather than rescind the offer, they honored it, and Kelsey began her graduate studies in pharmacology. It was at Chicago in 1937 that she encountered the formative experience that would inform her entire approach to drug regulation. The United States was in the grip of a medical disaster. A company called S.E. Massengill had marketed a product called elixir sulfanilamide, an antibiotic dissolved in diethylene glycol, the chemical relative of antifreeze. The formulation was poisonous. More than 100 people died, many of them children. A 6-year-old girl from Tulsa was among the victims, and her mother wrote a heartbreaking letter to President Franklin Roosevelt describing her daughter's suffering and death. Kelsey, working in Gehling's laboratory, was part of the team investigating how the poisoning occurred, studying the mechanism by which diethylene glycol caused kidney failure and death. She saw firsthand what happened when drugs were rushed to market without adequate testing, when profit was prioritized over safety, when regulatory oversight was insufficient or absent. The lesson stayed with her. Lax oversight kills people. Corners cut in testing led to tragedy. The burden of proof must rest with those who seek to market drugs, not with those who question their safety. She earned her Ph.D. in pharmacology in 1938, and later, recognizing that her career ambitions would benefit from medical training, she enrolled in the University of Chicago's medical school. In 1943, she married F. Ellis Kelsey, a fellow pharmacologist she had met at the university, and after earning her M.D. in 1950, she worked for a time as an editorial assistant for the Journal of the American Medical Association. This position, reviewing physician-submitted articles for publication, taught her another valuable skill: recognizing poor science. She learned that good scientists were almost invariably good writers, that clarity of thought produced clarity of expression, and conversely, that poor writing often signaled poor research. She learned to be skeptical of claims that were not supported by rigorous methodology. By 1960, Frances and Ellis Kelsey were living in South Dakota, where she had been practicing medicine and conducting research, but they missed urban life and decided to relocate. When a position opened at the FDA in Washington, she applied, and in August of 1960, she was hired as one of only 7 full-time physicians reviewing new drug applications for the agency. She was 46 years old, with decades of training and experience behind her, and she brought to the job a combination of scientific rigor, clinical knowledge, and a deep-seated conviction that drug safety could not be assumed. It had to be proven. 1 month into her tenure at the FDA, the application for Kevadon landed on her desk. Richardson Merrill, the pharmaceutical company seeking to market thalidomide in the United States, had submitted what they clearly expected to be a routine application. The drug was already approved and widely used in more than 20 countries. It had been on the market for years. Millions of people had taken it without apparent harm. The company anticipated that the FDA would approve Kevadon quickly, allowing them to begin marketing it for Christmas 1960, capitalizing on the year-end shopping season and the New Year's resolution market for better sleep and less anxiety. But Kelsey was not impressed by the fact that other countries had approved the drug. Other countries had different standards, different regulatory frameworks, different levels of rigor. Her job was to evaluate the evidence presented to the FDA, and the evidence in the Richardson Merrill application struck her as inadequate. The testimonials from doctors were largely anecdotal, lacking the scientific methodology that would make them meaningful. Kelsey recognized some of the authors as having published suspicious or fraudulent articles in the past. Their endorsements carried little weight with her. Moreover, the application contained no systematic studies, no controlled trials, no rigorous data that would allow an independent assessment of the drug's safety and efficacy. Under the regulations then in place, the FDA had 60 days to approve or reject a new drug application. If the agency did not act within that window, the drug was automatically approved and could be marketed. This was the rule Richardson Merrill was counting on. Submit the application, wait 60 days, begin sales. But the regulations also allowed the FDA to request additional information, and each time such a request was made, the 60-day clock reset. It was a loophole, a way for a diligent reviewer to prevent automatic approval while demanding the evidence that should have been included from the start. Kelsey used this provision repeatedly. She requested more data. Richardson Merrill provided some additional information, but it was still insufficient. She requested clarification on specific points. The company sent replies that did not fully address her concerns. She requested animal studies demonstrating safety during pregnancy, given that one of the proposed uses for Kevadon was treating morning sickness. The company sent partial data that Kelsey found misleading. What Kelsey did not know, what Richardson Merrill did not disclose, was that the company had tested thalidomide on pregnant rats and had observed birth defects in the offspring. This critical information was withheld from the FDA. Instead, the company sent carefully selected data that seemed to support their claims of safety. The company's frustration with Kelsey grew. executives at Richardson Merrill had expected approval by Christmas 1960. When that deadline passed, they expected approval by spring 1961. When spring came and went, their frustration turned to anger. The company representative assigned to handle the FDA application, F. Joseph Murray, began an aggressive campaign of pressure. He called Kelsey's office repeatedly. He visited in person again and again. Over the course of 18 months, there were approximately 50 separate contacts, phone calls, letters, office visits, all designed to convince, cajole, or intimidate Kelsey into approving the application. Murray complained to Kelsey's supervisors, calling her a nitpicker, a petty bureaucrat, an obstinate obstacle to legitimate business. He questioned her competence. He suggested she was being unreasonable. He made it clear that Richardson Merrill was a major pharmaceutical company with significant influence, and that her continued refusal was damaging their business interests. Kelsey later recalled that most of the things they called her were not suitable for print, but her supervisors at the FDA stood by her. They reviewed her concerns and found them valid. They refused to pressure her into approving a drug she believed had not been adequately tested. And Kelsey herself remained unmoved by the intimidation. She had her husband, Ellis, review her conclusions to ensure she was not missing something, that her skepticism was justified. He confirmed her assessment. The data was insufficient. The safety claims were not proven. What sustained Kelsey's resistance was not stubbornness or bureaucratic rigidity. It was the scientific training that had taught her to demand evidence. And it was the memory of that 6-year-old girl from Tulsa, poisoned by elixir sulfanilamide, because no one had properly tested the formulation before it was marketed. Kelsey had seen what happened when oversight failed. She was not going to let it happen again, not on her watch, not if she could prevent it. And then, as 1961 progressed, reports began arriving from Europe that vindicated every one of her concerns. The first public warning came in the form of a letter published in The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, in December of 1961. Dr. William McBride, the Australian obstetrician who had once championed thalidomide as a treatment for morning sickness, now wrote to describe the devastating pattern he had observed among his patients. Women who had taken the drug during pregnancy were giving birth to babies with severe abnormalities at an alarming rate. McBride estimated that 1 in 5 pregnancies where thalidomide had been used resulted in a child with major deformities. The most common presentation was phocomelia, the absence or severe shortening of limbs, but there were also malformations of the ears, eyes, internal organs, facial structures, digestive systems. McBride's letter was brief, clinical in its language, but the implications were staggering. The drug that had been marketed as safe for pregnant women was in fact catastrophically dangerous to developing fetuses. In Germany, Dr. Wedekind Lenz had reached the same conclusion through his independent investigation, and in November of 1961, he presented his findings to Chemie Grünenthal. His data was extensive, his methodology sound, his conclusion unavoidable. Thalidomide was a teratogen of extraordinary potency. The critical window of vulnerability was approximately days 20 to 36 after conception, the period when the embryo's organs and limbs were forming. A woman who took even a single tablet of thalidomide during this window could give birth to a severely disabled child. The specific timing of exposure determined the specific deformity. If thalidomide was taken around day 20, when the neural tube was closing and the brain was beginning to form, the result could be central nervous system damage. Around day 22, as the structures that would become ears and facial features were developing, thalidomide exposure could produce malformed or absent ears, hearing impairment, facial abnormalities. Day 24 was when the upper limb buds were forming. Exposure at this point resulted in shortened or absent arms. By day 28, the lower limb buds were developing, and thalidomide taken then could cause shortened or absent legs. The damage was not dose-dependent in the way toxicologists usually measured harm. It was not true that taking more thalidomide produced worse effects. Rather, a single tablet taken at precisely the wrong moment in pregnancy was sufficient to cause profound and permanent disability. The drug did not need to accumulate in the system. It did not need to be taken repeatedly. One tablet, one time, at the wrong time, was enough. On November 26, 1961, Chemie Grünenthal withdrew Contergan from the German market. The decision came more than 5 years after the first affected baby, the child of their own employee, had been born on Christmas Day, 1956. It came after hundreds, perhaps thousands, of German babies had already been born with thalidomide-induced deformities. But finally, the company acknowledged the connection and removed the drug from sale. In the United Kingdom, Distillers Company followed suit on December 2, 1961, withdrawing Distaval from British pharmacies. Australia, Canada, and other countries moved to ban the drug or restrict its distribution. The pharmaceutical companies that had licensed thalidomide scrambled to recall their products, to notify doctors, to warn patients. But the drug did not disappear overnight. It remained in medicine cabinets in homes across every country where it had been sold. It remained in pharmacies, in hospitals, on shelves, in storerooms and clinics. Some countries were slower to act. Spain, incredibly, continued to allow the sale of thalidomide through much of the 1970s and perhaps even into the 1980s. The Spanish government would not even admit that the country had imported thalidomide until 2008. Nearly 50 years after the drug was first marketed. In the United States, Richardson Merrill finally withdrew their FDA application on March 8, 1962. By that point, the European evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. There would be no American approval. There would be no Kevadon marketed across the United States as a safe sedative and morning sickness remedy. Frances Kelsey's careful scrutiny, her refusal to be rushed, her insistence on adequate proof, all of this had prevented the United States from experiencing the same scale of tragedy that had devastated other nations. But America was not entirely spared. The clinical trials that Richardson Merrill had conducted, the millions of pills distributed to more than 1,000 doctors, given to approximately 20,000 patients, with at least 600 pregnant women among them, these had consequences. The official FDA position, maintained for decades, was that only 6 American children survived with thalidomide-induced disabilities. The true number is almost certainly much higher, dozens at minimum, with scores of miscarriages and stillbirths that were never properly documented or attributed to the drug. One known case illustrates the tragedy that did reach American shores. In May of 1961, a family on Long Island, New York, gave birth to twins. The boy was born without arms, his hands growing directly from his shoulders. The girl suffered from multiple internal deformities. Their mother was a German woman who had met her husband while studying in Florence in 1959. She had come to the United States carrying Contergan tablets she had brought from Germany, along with a prescription from her physician. She had been taking the medication, trusting in its proclaimed safety. The family would later sue Chemie Grünenthal, alleging negligence in testing and failure to warn of the effects on unborn children. But no lawsuit could restore what had been taken from those children or from the family. The global toll was becoming clear as 1962 began. Estimates suggested that more than 10,000 babies had been born with thalidomide-induced deformities across the 46 countries where the drug had been sold. Some estimates reached as high as 20,000. Approximately 40% of the affected babies died at or shortly after birth, their bodies simply unable to sustain life with the severe internal malformations they carried. Those who survived faced a lifetime of challenges in a world not designed for bodies shaped differently than most. The most visible and characteristic deformity was phocomelia, the seal limb syndrome. In its most severe form, amelia, there were no limbs at all. In less severe cases, there might be shortened long bones, with hands or feet present but attached close to the body, rather than at the end of fully developed arms and legs. Thumbs were often absent or malformed. Fingers might be missing or fused. The arms were affected more commonly than the legs, though both could be damaged. The pattern was usually symmetrical, both arms or both legs affected to roughly the same degree, though unilateral cases did occur. But the damage was not limited to limbs. Thalidomide affected every system that was developing during that critical window. The ears, both external structures and the inner ear mechanisms for hearing, could be malformed or absent. Eyes might be improperly formed, vision impaired or absent. The heart, forming during this same period, could have structural defects, holes between chambers, improperly developed valves, vessels emerging from the wrong locations. The digestive system, the kidneys, the genitourinary tract, all could show abnormalities. Some children were born with damage so extensive and so severe that survival beyond a few hours or days was impossible. For those who survived infancy, the challenges were immense. Basic activities that most people take for granted, feeding themselves, dressing, bathing, writing, walking, required adaptation, assistance, specialized equipment, or were simply impossible. The psychological toll was equally severe. Growing up visibly different, facing stares and questions, navigating a world of stairs and doorknobs and handshakes designed for bodies unlike their own. And the families, parents who had been told they were taking something safe, something that would ease their discomfort, something that posed no risk to their babies. They faced guilt, grief, anger, the practical challenges of caring for children with complex medical needs, the financial burden of equipment and surgeries and therapies that insurance often did not cover. Many marriages fractured under the strain. Many mothers blamed themselves, carrying the weight of a decision that had been made in trust, in innocence, in reasonable reliance on the assurances they had been given. The medical profession faced its own reckoning. The assumption that the placenta protected the developing fetus had been proven catastrophically wrong. The belief that animal testing was sufficient to predict human safety had failed. The trust placed in pharmaceutical companies to test their products adequately before marketing them had been betrayed. Medicine would have to change. Regulation would have to change. The entire system of drug development and approval would have to be rebuilt on a foundation of greater rigor, greater skepticism, greater caution. But first, there would be recognition for the woman who had stood in the gap, who had said no when pressure and profit and impatience all demanded yes. The story that America told itself about thalidomide was, for many years, a story of narrow escape. It was a narrative of vigilance rewarded, of a single dedicated public servant standing between the nation and disaster. This story was true as far as it went. Francis Kelsey had indeed prevented the widespread marketing of thalidomide in the United States, and thousands of American families were spared the grief that had befallen their counterparts in Europe, Australia, Canada, and across the globe. But the story as commonly told was incomplete. It elided certain uncomfortable truths, glossed over certain failures, left certain victims invisible. The reality was more complex and more troubling than the heroic narrative suggested. Richardson Merrill had not waited for FDA approval before distributing thalidomide across the United States. Their so-called clinical trials, conducted between 1959 and 1962, had placed millions of pills into circulation. The company's detail men, pharmaceutical sales representatives, had distributed these pills to more than 1,200 physicians, who in turn had prescribed them to approximately 20,000 patients. Among those patients were at least 600 pregnant women, and likely more. The records were incomplete, sometimes non-existent. Many doctors had not kept careful documentation of who received the drug, in what dosage, for what condition, with what results. Some pills had been handed out in unmarked envelopes. Some had been given in bottles with minimal labeling, experimental medication, or simply the Merrell Company name. When the connection between thalidomide and birth defects became public knowledge in late 1961 and early 1962, Richardson Merrill faced a crisis. The company needed to recall the medication, to notify the doctors who had received samples, to warn any patients who might still have pills in their possession. But they also had a reputation to protect and potential liability to minimize. The company's response was, by most accounts, inadequate. Doctors were informed that the drug should no longer be prescribed, but there was no systematic effort to identify and warn every patient who had received it. There was no obligation, legal or otherwise, for doctors to alert patients to what drug they had been given during the experimental phase. This meant that women who had taken thalidomide during pregnancy, women who had been given pills in unmarked envelopes and told they were receiving a safe sedative or anti-nausea medication, might never know they had been exposed. If they gave birth to a child with deformities, they might never understand why. The doctors who had prescribed the medication, if they kept poor records or had not retained the information about which experimental drug they had been distributing, might not even realize the connection. The official FDA position, maintained for decades, was that 17 children in the United States were born with thalidomide-induced malformations, and that only 6 of these survived infancy. These numbers have been repeated in government documents, in medical literature, in historical accounts. But researchers who have examined the question more carefully, who have reviewed hospital records and birth registries and interviewed surviving victims, believe the true toll is almost certainly higher. Dozens of American children likely bear the physical evidence of thalidomide exposure. Scores of miscarriages and stillbirths may have resulted from the drug. The actual number will never be known with certainty because the distribution was so poorly monitored and the follow-up so incomplete. Cincinnati, Ohio, where Richardson Merrill was headquartered, bore a disproportionate share of the American burden. The company had naturally focused much of its early distribution in its home market, and Ohio physicians had received substantial quantities of the experimental medication. Ohio families, Ohio pregnant women, Ohio babies. The local connection between the pharmaceutical company and the tragedy it helped create would become a source of shame and anger in the community. The Long Island twins, born in May of 1961, became one of the most documented American cases, in part because their mother's connection to Germany provided a clear explanation for her possession of Contergan tablets. The boy, born without arms, his hands emerging directly from his shoulders. The girl, born with internal abnormalities that would require multiple surgeries and lifelong medical management. Their parents sued Hemi Grunenthal, seeking accountability and compensation for the harm done to their children. The lawsuit alleged negligence in testing, failure to conduct adequate studies before marketing, failure to warn of the risks to pregnant women. The legal battle would drag on for years, and while it would eventually be settled, no amount of money could restore what had been taken from those children or repair the trust that had been broken. But even as some American families struggled in private with the consequences of thalidomide exposure, the public narrative was focused elsewhere, on the woman who had prevented a wider catastrophe, and on the implications for drug regulation in the United States. The story broke on July 15, 1962, when the Washington Post published a front-page article by reporter Morton Mintz. The headline described Dr. Frances Kelsey as a heroine whose skepticism and stubbornness had prevented what could have been an appalling American tragedy. The article detailed her careful review of the Richardson Merrill application, her repeated requests for more data, her resistance to corporate pressure, and her vindication when the European evidence of thalidomide's dangers emerged. Mintz wrote that Kelsey had prevented the birth of hundreds or indeed thousands of armless and legless children in the United States. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. In an era when government bureaucrats were often portrayed as inefficient obstacles to progress, here was a story of a federal employee doing her job superbly, protecting the public through diligence and integrity. Kelsey became a symbol of what good government could achieve, of what careful oversight could prevent. Letters poured into the FDA praising her. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. She appeared on lists of the most admired women in America, her name mentioned alongside Eleanor Roosevelt and other luminaries. Kelsey herself was modest about her role. She insisted that her assistants deserved credit, particularly the pharmacologists Oyama Jiro and Lee Giesma, who had worked with her on the review. She emphasized that her supervisors at the FDA had supported her decisions and backed her against Richardson Merrill's pressure. She framed her actions not as heroism, but as simply doing the job she had been hired to do, applying the scientific standards that should govern all drug approvals. But the public saw a hero, and so did the President of the United States. On August 7th, 1962, on the lawn of the White House, Frances Kelsey stood in a proper hat and white gloves as President John F. Kennedy presented her with the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service. It was the nation's highest honor for a government employee, and Kelsey was only the second woman to receive it. Kennedy praised her exceptional judgment in preventing a major tragedy of birth deformities in the United States. He spoke of her courage in resisting pressure from a powerful pharmaceutical company, her insistence on scientific rigor, her unwillingness to compromise public safety for the sake of corporate profits or bureaucratic convenience. The ceremony was photographed extensively. Images of Kennedy handing the award to Kelsey, both of them smiling, appeared in newspapers across the country and around the world. The moment captured something that Americans wanted to believe about their government: that the system could work, that dedicated public servants could make a difference, that individual integrity could triumph over institutional pressure. But while Kelsey was being honored, the medical community was engaged in a painful reckoning with the assumptions that had been shattered by thalidomide. Dr. Helen B. Taussig, a renowned pediatric cardiologist at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, had been among the first American physicians to investigate the thalidomide tragedy in person. In the spring of 1962, she had traveled to Germany and observed the affected infants firsthand. She had examined babies with phocomelia, with absent limbs, with malformed internal organs. She had spoken with German physicians and with grieving families. When she returned to the United States, she testified before Congress about what she had witnessed, describing in clinical detail the devastating effects of the drug. Taussig's testimony was instrumental in building political support for stronger drug regulation. She explained how thalidomide had circumvented every safeguard that medicine had believed was in place. The drug had been tested on animals and found to be non-toxic by traditional measures. It had been used by millions of people without apparent harm to adults. It had been marketed with the approval of regulatory authorities in multiple countries. And yet, it had caused catastrophic damage to developing fetuses, operating through mechanisms that were not well understood, and during a window of vulnerability that was narrow but devastating. The myth of the impenetrable placental barrier had been destroyed. For generations, medical textbooks had taught that the placenta filtered the mother's blood, allowing nutrients and oxygen to pass to the fetus while blocking harmful substances. The few exceptions, syphilis and certain other infections, were treated as anomalies. The prevailing assumption was that drugs taken by the mother stayed in the mother, that the developing baby was protected in its amniotic sanctuary. Thalidomide proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. The drug crossed the placenta easily. It circulated in the developing embryo's blood. It interfered with the biochemical processes that governed limb development, organ formation, the intricate choreography of cells dividing and differentiating and migrating to their proper positions. The mechanisms were not yet fully understood. They remain subjects of active research even today. But the effect was undeniable. Medical schools revised their curricula. Textbooks were rewritten. Physicians in practice were forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about prescribing medications during pregnancy. The casual attitude toward drug use by pregnant women, the assumption that most medications posed minimal risk, gave way to a new caution, a new awareness that the first trimester of pregnancy, when organs and limbs are forming, is a period of extraordinary vulnerability. The field of teratology, the study of birth defects and their causes, expanded rapidly in the wake of thalidomide. Researchers worked to identify other teratogenic substances, to understand the mechanisms by which chemical exposures during pregnancy could affect fetal development, to establish guidelines for testing new drugs for reproductive safety. The critical window of days 20 to 36 post-conception became a focus of intense study. This was the period when the embryo was transforming from a cluster of cells into a recognizable human form, when the neural tube was closing, when limb buds were emerging, when the foundations of every organ system were being laid down. Any disruption during this window could have permanent consequences. But understanding came too late for the children already born with thalidomide-induced disabilities. Their reality was not one of scientific interest or policy debates or regulatory reform. Their reality was physical, immediate, and permanent. Phocomelia, the most characteristic and visible of the thalidomide deformities, presented in a spectrum of severity. In the most extreme cases, amelia, there were no limbs at all. The body simply ended at the shoulder or hip, with perhaps a small remnant of tissue where an arm or leg should have emerged. In less severe but still profound cases, the long bones, humerus, radius, ulna in the arms, femur, tibia, fibula in the legs, were absent or severely shortened. Hands might emerge directly from the shoulder, feet directly from the hip, creating the seal-like flippers that gave the condition its name. In still other cases, some portions of the limb might develop while others did not. A hand with fingers might be present, but attached to a shortened or absent forearm. A foot might be normally formed, but connected to a stub of leg. The thumbs were often the first structures affected, absent or malformed, even in cases where other parts of the hand developed more normally. The radius, the bone on the thumb side of the forearm, was more sensitive to thalidomide damage than the ulna. Why this pattern existed, why certain structures were more vulnerable than others, remained questions that researchers would work to answer for decades. The arms were more commonly and more severely affected than the legs, a pattern that reflected the timing of limb development. Upper limb buds emerge slightly earlier in embryonic development than lower limb buds, and thalidomide's relatively short half-life in the body meant that a single dose might damage the arms while sparing the legs, simply because the drug had been metabolized and eliminated by the time the lower limbs were forming. But limbs were not the only structures affected. The ears, particularly the external structures, but also the inner ear mechanisms responsible for hearing, could be malformed or absent. Some children were born completely deaf. Others had hearing impairments of varying degrees. The external ears might be small, misshapen, or positioned abnormally. In some cases, there was simply no external ear structure at all. The eyes could be affected, with children born blind or with significant visual impairments. The structures of the eye might fail to form properly, or the optic nerve might be damaged. Facial features could be altered, cleft palate, facial asymmetry, abnormalities in the structure of the nose or mouth. Internal organs presented less visible but equally serious problems. Hearts could have structural defects, holes between chambers, improperly formed valves, blood vessels emerging from incorrect positions. Some of these defects were incompatible with life. Others required immediate surgery and lifelong monitoring. The digestive system could be affected, with portions of the intestines malformed or missing, requiring complex surgical reconstruction. The kidneys, the urinary tract, the reproductive organs, all developed during the same critical window, and all could show abnormalities. The children who survived infancy faced a lifetime of challenges. Simple tasks became complex problems requiring creative solutions. How do you eat if you have no hands, or only rudimentary hands without opposable thumbs? How do you dress yourself? How do you write, turn a doorknob, tie shoes, brush teeth? Many survivors became remarkably adept at using their feet for tasks normally performed by hands, developing dexterity and coordination that astonished observers. But this adaptability came at a cost. The physical strain of using the body in ways it was not designed to function, the social isolation of being visibly different, the constant awareness of stares and questions and pity. The psychological toll was immense. Depression and anxiety were common among thalidomide survivors, affecting more than 90% according to later surveys. Chronic pain was nearly universal, the result of joints and muscles compensating for missing or malformed structures, of bodies bearing loads they were never meant to carry. As survivors aged, these problems intensified. The wear and tear accumulated. Pain that had been manageable in youth became debilitating in middle age. The financial burden on families was crushing. Prosthetic limbs, when they could be fitted and when they were functional, cost thousands of dollars and required replacement as children grew. Adapted vehicles, electronic wheelchairs, specialized hearing aids, or cochlear implants, modifications to homes to make them accessible. All of this required money that many families did not have. Insurance companies often refused to cover equipment they deemed not medically necessary, even though these devices meant the difference between independence and total dependence. Many survivors were unable to work, or could work only in limited capacities. More than 40% reported being unable to work because of their disabilities or related health problems. Another quarter had to change careers or reduce their work hours as they aged, and the physical demands became unsustainable. The loss of earning potential compounded the already substantial costs of living with thalidomide-induced disabilities. And through it all, there was the knowledge, impossible to escape, impossible to ignore, that this had been preventable. That if the drug had been tested properly, if the warnings had been heeded, if corporate profits had not been prioritized over human safety, if regulatory systems had been more rigorous, this would not have happened. The children and their families carried not just the physical and financial burdens of disability, but the psychological burden of knowing that someone, somewhere, had made choices that led to this outcome. That this was not an act of God or a random misfortune, but a failure of science, of ethics, of the systems meant to protect public health. In the United States, recognition for Francis Kelsey came swiftly. The ceremony at the White House, the award from President Kennedy, the acclaim from press and public, all of this happened within weeks of the thalidomide story breaking. But justice for the victims, accountability for the companies responsible, compensation for the families whose lives had been irrevocably altered, that would take much longer. The fight for accountability had only just begun, and it would prove far more difficult than anyone anticipated. The recognition afforded to Francis Kelsey was swift and well-deserved. The accountability sought from those who had manufactured, marketed, and distributed thalidomide would prove far more elusive. The path from tragedy to justice is often long and winding, obstructed by corporate legal strategies, by the complexities of international law, by the difficulty of proving causation in cases where the science is still emerging, and by the simple fact that acknowledging responsibility carries with it enormous financial and reputational costs. The thalidomide story would demonstrate all of these obstacles, and in doing so would reveal uncomfortable truths about how accountability functions or fails to function in cases of pharmaceutical disaster. But first came the legislative response, and here, at least action was relatively swift. The thalidomide tragedy had created a political environment in which reform was not only possible, but inevitable. Senator Estes Kefauver, a Democrat from Tennessee, had been working on pharmaceutical industry reform for more than 2 years before thalidomide became public knowledge. Kefauver had served as his party's vice presidential candidate in 1956, running alongside Adlai Stevenson, and he had developed a reputation as a crusader against corporate abuses. As chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Antitrust and Monopoly, he had conducted extensive hearings into the pharmaceutical industry, examining issues of pricing, marketing practices, the relationship between drug companies and physicians, and the adequacy of drug testing before products reached market. The hearings had revealed disturbing patterns. Drug companies were spending far more on marketing and advertising than on research. Doctors were being courted with gifts, with sponsored trips, with promotional materials that emphasized benefits while minimizing risks. Me Too drugs, minor variations on existing medications that offered no real therapeutic advantage, were being patented and marketed as breakthrough treatments, allowing companies to charge premium prices for essentially the same chemical compounds. Claims of efficacy were often based on flimsy evidence or no evidence at all. The entire system seemed designed to maximize profits rather than to advance genuine therapeutic progress or to ensure patient safety. Kefauver had introduced a bill, S1552, intended to address these problems. The bill proposed significant reforms, stricter testing requirements, greater FDA oversight, controls on drug advertising, limits on patent protections to encourage competition and lower prices. But the pharmaceutical industry was powerful and politically connected, and the bill faced fierce opposition. By June of 1962, it appeared dead. The Kennedy administration, initially supportive, had backed away. Industry lobbyists had successfully gutted the most aggressive provisions. The bill that remained was a shadow of what Kefauver had originally proposed, and even that watered-down version seemed unlikely to pass. Then, in mid-July of 1962, the Washington Post published Morton Mintz's front-page story about Francis Kelsey and thalidomide. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Here was a concrete example of exactly what Kefauver had been warning about. A drug inadequately tested, aggressively marketed, approved in dozens of countries despite warning signs, and ultimately revealed to be catastrophically dangerous. The fact that the United States had been spared the worst of the tragedy only because of one diligent FDA reviewer highlighted how vulnerable the system was, how close the nation had come to disaster. The political dynamics shifted overnight. Senators who had opposed Kefauver's bill now found themselves unable to justify that opposition to an alarmed public. The Kennedy administration renewed its support. Amendments that had been removed were restored. Additional provisions were added. The bill gained momentum and moved quickly through Congress, propelled by public outrage and by the desire of politicians to be seen as taking action to prevent a future thalidomide. On October 10, 1962, less than 3 months after the thalidomide story broke, President Kennedy signed the Drug Amendments of 1962 into law. The legislation, formerly known as the Kefauver-Harris Amendments to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, represented the most significant expansion of FDA authority since the agency's creation. The amendments required, for the first time, that drug manufacturers prove not only that their products were safe, but also that they were effective for their intended uses. This seemingly obvious requirement that a drug should actually work had not previously been mandatory. Before 1962, a company only needed to demonstrate that a drug would not cause immediate harm. Whether it provided any therapeutic benefit was essentially left to the market to determine. The new law demanded adequate and well-controlled investigations as the basis for approval. This phrase became the foundation for the modern system of clinical trials. Phase 1, studies to assess basic safety and dosage. Phase 2, studies to evaluate efficacy in small groups. Phase 3, large-scale trials comparing new drugs to existing treatments or placebos. The randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial, still the gold standard for drug testing, emerged from this requirement. The amendments also required informed consent from patients participating in clinical trials. No longer could drugs be tested on unwitting subjects, as Richardson Merrill had done with its distribution of Kevidon to 20,000 Americans who believed they were receiving approved medication. Participants had to be told they were part of an experiment, informed of potential risks, and given the choice to decline. Adverse drug reactions had to be reported to the FDA, creating a surveillance system to detect problems after drugs reached the market. Drug advertising had to include accurate information about side effects and risks, not just promotional claims about benefits. The automatic approval provision, the rule that had allowed drugs to be marketed if the FDA did not act within 60 days, was eliminated. The agency now had to specifically approve each drug before it could be sold. These reforms represented a fundamental shift in the regulatory framework. The burden of proof now rested firmly with the pharmaceutical companies. They had to demonstrate through rigorous scientific evidence that their products were both safe and effective. The FDA's role evolved from passive gatekeeper to active evaluator, with the authority and the responsibility to demand comprehensive data before granting approval. Other countries implemented similar reforms, though the pace and extent varied. The United Kingdom, which had suffered hundreds of thalidomide cases, strengthened its regulatory systems. Australia, Canada, and nations across Europe revised their drug approval processes. The international pharmaceutical industry faced a new reality in which testing requirements were more stringent, approval timelines were longer, and the consequences of releasing an unsafe or ineffective drug were potentially catastrophic. But while regulatory systems were being reformed, the question of accountability for what had already occurred remained unresolved. And here, the response was far less satisfying. In West Germany, where the largest number of thalidomide victims had been born, approximately 5,000 children, the path to accountability led to a criminal trial. In 1968, charges were filed against multiple officials from Chemie Grünenthal. The charges included negligent homicide and negligent injury, based on allegations that the company had known or should have known about the dangers of thalidomide and had failed to act appropriately to protect the public. The trial began amid intense public interest and international attention. The evidence presented was damning. Internal company documents showed that Grünenthal had received warnings about thalidomide's effects as early as 1956, when the Berlin doctor reported the drug's absolute intolerability. Reports of peripheral neuritis had accumulated through 1959 and 1960, clear evidence that the drug was neurotoxic. The company's own employee had given birth to a thalidomide-affected child on Christmas Day, 1956. Yet no investigation had been triggered. Allegations emerged that Grunenthal had attempted to suppress publication of negative findings, that they had pressured researchers not to speak publicly about their concerns, that they had threatened Dr. Widukind Lenz with legal action when he sought to publish his findings, linking thalidomide to birth defects. The prosecution argued that these actions demonstrated a pattern of negligence rising to the level of criminal conduct. The company had prioritized profits over safety. They had ignored warning signs. They had continued to market the drug as completely safe even after evidence suggested otherwise. They had failed in their most basic responsibility as a pharmaceutical manufacturer. Grunenthal's defense rested largely on the argument that no one could have known. The science of teratology was not well developed in the 1950s. The assumption that the placenta protected the fetus was widely held. Animal testing, which had shown thalidomide to be safe, was the accepted standard. The company had followed the practices of the era. To judge them by standards that only emerged after the tragedy, the defense argued, was unfair. The trial dragged on for 2 years, becoming one of the longest and most complex criminal proceedings in German legal history. But it would not reach a conclusion. In April of 1970, Grunenthal reached a financial settlement with the victims, agreeing to pay compensation through a trust fund. As part of the settlement, the criminal charges were effectively abandoned. The trial concluded in December 1970, with no finding of guilt, no criminal convictions, no one held legally responsible for the deaths and disabilities of thousands of children. The settlement provided some financial support to German victims, but the amounts were modest relative to the lifelong costs of living with severe disabilities, and the lack of criminal accountability left many feeling that justice had not been served, that the company had effectively bought its way out of consequences. In the United Kingdom, a similar battle played out over compensation. The Distillers Company, which had marketed Distaval throughout Britain, initially resisted any responsibility. Families began filing lawsuits, seeking compensation for the medical costs and lifelong care needs of their affected children. The legal process was slow and expensive, requiring families already under enormous financial and emotional strain to navigate complex litigation against a large corporation with substantial legal resources. The first settlement came in February 1968, but only for 62 children and only at 40% of the assessed damages. The amount was widely recognized as grossly inadequate. A child born without arms or legs, facing a lifetime of medical interventions, equipment needs, and reduced earning potential, received a one-time payment that would cover only a fraction of those costs. Public outrage grew, fueled in part by a campaign led by the Sunday Times newspaper. In 1972, a high-profile effort to pressure distillers into a more adequate settlement gained momentum. Public opinion turned decisively against the company. Finally, in 1973, the Thalidomide Children's Trust was established as part of a £20 million settlement for 429 affected children in the UK. It was more substantial than the initial offer, but still left many families struggling. In 1997, after Distillers had been acquired by Guinness, and Guinness had merged with Grand Metropolitan to form Diageo, the successor corporation made a long-term financial commitment to support the Thalidomide Trust. In 2009, the UK government added a £20 million grant to support survivors as they aged and their medical needs increased. These later contributions acknowledged what had become increasingly clear. The initial settlements had been inadequate to meet the actual ongoing costs of thalidomide-induced disabilities. Australia saw similar battles. Lynette Rowe, born without limbs, led a class action lawsuit against Grunenthal. The company fought to have the case heard in Germany rather than Australia, presumably calculating that German courts might be more favorable to a German company. But in 2012, the Supreme Court of Victoria ruled that the case would remain in Australian jurisdiction. On July 17, 2012, Rowe was awarded an out-of-court settlement believed to be in the millions of dollars. In February 2014, a broader settlement of 89 million Australian dollars was distributed among 107 Australian and New Zealand victims. Canada's response was perhaps the slowest and most inadequate. The country had approved thalidomide for sale, and Canadian women had taken it during pregnancy, giving birth to approximately 100 affected children. But for decades, the Canadian government offered no compensation, no support beyond what was available through general disability programs. It was only in 2015, more than 50 years after the drug was withdrawn, that the federal government finally offered its regrets and agreed to grant pensions to survivors, up to $100,000 annually for life. The recognition came so late that many victims had already died. In 2012, Grunenthal's CEO, Harold Stock, issued a formal apology, standing before a bronze statue of a thalidomide-affected child at the company's headquarters. Stock expressed regret for the suffering caused by thalidomide. It was 56 years after the first known victim had been born. The apology was met with mixed reactions. Some survivors appreciated the acknowledgement. Many others called it insulting and far too late. They noted that Grunenthal offered no new compensation, that the company continued to claim it had conducted all possible tests based on the science of the era, and that this assertion was contradicted by the documented evidence of ignored warnings and suppressed research. By the time of the apology, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 thalidomide survivors remained alive worldwide. They continued to face the physical consequences of the drug every day. Chronic pain, affecting more than 90% of survivors, was worsening as they aged. Mobility was declining. The compensatory movements that had allowed them to function, using feet for tasks normally done by hands, bearing weight on joints not designed for such loads, were taking their toll. Bodies that had adapted remarkably in youth were breaking down in middle age. The fight for accountability had produced mixed results. Regulatory reforms had succeeded in creating stronger safeguards for future drug approvals. Compensation had eventually been provided to victims, though often inadequate and always delayed. But criminal accountability had been avoided. No executives had been imprisoned. No one had been held personally responsible in a way that might deter similar conduct in the future. The legacy of thalidomide thus included not only the victims and the regulatory reforms, but also a troubling precedent that pharmaceutical companies might cause massive harm through negligence, ignore warning signs, suppress negative findings, and ultimately face primarily financial consequences that could be absorbed as a cost of doing business. The question of whether the system had truly learned its lesson, whether the reforms were sufficient, whether accountability mechanisms were adequate to prevent future tragedies, these questions remained open, awaiting answers that would only come with time. The reforms that emerged from the thalidomide tragedy reshaped pharmaceutical development in ways that persist to this day. The modern drug approval process, with its phases of clinical trials and its demands for rigorous evidence, traces its lineage directly to the Kefauver-Harris Amendments of 1962. What had once been a relatively informal system, based largely on manufacturer claims and limited testing, became a structured framework requiring years of study before a single pill could be sold to the public. Preclinical testing expanded dramatically. Animal studies became more comprehensive, involving multiple species rather than just mice and rats. Pregnant animals were included specifically to assess teratogenic potential. Researchers looked not just for acute toxicity, the Zobacay lethal dose that kills half the test subjects, but for subtle effects on development, on organ function, on long-term health. The assumption that a drug safe for adults must be safe for everyone was abandoned, replaced by a recognition that different populations, pregnant women, children, the elderly, might respond differently to the same medication. The clinical trial system formalized into distinct phases. Phase 1 studies assess basic safety in small groups of healthy volunteers, determining appropriate dosage ranges and identifying immediate adverse effects. Phase 2 studies involve larger groups of patients with the target condition, evaluating both efficacy and side effects. Phase 3 trials are large-scale comparative studies, often involving thousands of participants, designed to establish definitively whether a new drug works better than existing treatments or placebos. Even after approval, Phase 4 post-marketing surveillance continues to monitor for rare adverse events that might not appear in smaller trials. This system is not perfect. Rare side effects can still slip through. Long-term consequences may not become apparent for years or decades. The system is expensive and time-consuming, sometimes delaying beneficial drugs from reaching patients who need them. But the alternative, the world before thalidomide, when drugs could be marketed with minimal evidence, produced a catastrophe that no one wished to repeat. The field of teratology emerged as a distinct discipline in the wake of thalidomide. Researchers worked to understand the mechanisms by which chemical exposures during pregnancy affect fetal development. They identified the critical windows when different organ systems are forming, when interference can cause permanent damage. They developed systems for classifying drugs based on their safety during pregnancy, providing guidance to physicians about which medications could be prescribed and which must be avoided. Frances Kelsey did not rest on the laurels of her 1962 recognition. She continued working at the FDA for more than 4 decades, leading efforts to strengthen drug testing protocols and ensure scientific integrity in the approval process. She championed informed consent requirements, insisting that research subjects had the right to know they were participating in experiments and to understand the risks involved. She prosecuted 16 researchers who submitted fraudulent data to the FDA, and 6 of them served time in prison. Her career became a testament to the principle that regulatory oversight, done properly, protects public health without stifling innovation. In 2010, the FDA created the Dr. Frances O. Kelsey Award for Excellence and Courage in Protecting Public Health, recognizing one staff member annually for exceptional work in drug safety. Kelsey herself received the first award at age 96. She continued working until 2005, finally retiring at age 91. She died on August 7, 2015, at the age of 101, having lived long enough to see the regulatory framework she helped build become the international standard for drug approval. But perhaps the strangest twist in the thalidomide story is the drug's medical renaissance. The very properties that made it dangerous to developing fetuses, its ability to prevent blood vessel formation, proved valuable in treating certain conditions. In 1998, the FDA approved thalidomide for treating leprosy, where it reduces inflammatory skin lesions by blocking angiogenesis. Later approvals came for multiple myeloma, a blood cancer, where thalidomide's anti-angiogenic properties starve tumors of the blood supply they need to grow. The drug has also shown promise in treating other conditions, including Behçet's disease and certain complications of HIV. Thalidomide is now sold legally in the United States and many other countries, but under the most stringent controls ever applied to a medication. Prescribing requires extensive documentation. Patients must be enrolled in restricted distribution programs. Women of childbearing potential must use 2 forms of contraception and undergo regular pregnancy testing. The systems are designed to prevent any possibility of exposure during pregnancy. Yet even these controls have proven insufficient in some places. Brazil, where thalidomide is used to treat leprosy, has seen a new generation of thalidomide survivors born since the drug's reintroduction. Between 2005 and 2010, more than 30 cases of thalidomide embryopathy were documented in Brazil. The reasons are complex: cultural practices of medication sharing, less stringent prescription monitoring, misunderstanding of warning labels, pregnant women taking the drug while suffering from leprosy without realizing the risk. Each new case demonstrates that the lessons of 1961 must be relearned by each generation, that the systems designed to prevent tragedy require constant vigilance to remain effective. The survivors of the original thalidomide tragedy continue to navigate a world not designed for their bodies. Approximately 3,000 remain alive worldwide, including 415 beneficiaries of the UK's Thalidomide Trust. They face challenges that intensify with age. Bodies that compensated remarkably in youth are failing in middle age. Joints deteriorate from decades of bearing loads they were never meant to carry. Chronic pain, nearly universal among survivors, worsens as the years accumulate. More than 40% can no longer work due to disability or health complications. Some have achieved remarkable success despite these obstacles. Matt Fraser became a rock musician, actor and performance artist in the UK, producing documentaries about disability and challenging societal assumptions. Thomas Quasthoff became an internationally acclaimed bass baritone opera singer. Lorraine Mercer became the only thalidomide survivor to carry the Olympic torch. José Lake became a Paralympic, gold medal-winning swimmer and president of the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada. Their accomplishments speak to human resilience, to the refusal to be defined by disability, to the determination to live fully despite circumstances they never chose. But their existence also serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when the pursuit of profit overrides the obligation to ensure safety, when warning signs are ignored, when regulatory systems fail, when the people entrusted with protecting public health prioritize convenience over caution. The white, crystalline powder that began in a German laboratory in 1954 left a mark on medicine that can never be erased. Over 10,000 children were born with catastrophic deformities because a drug was inadequately tested, aggressively marketed, and prescribed based on promises rather than proof. Approximately 40% of those children died in infancy. The survivors carry the physical evidence of that failure in their bodies. Every day, the legacy of thalidomide is dual in nature. It is a warning about hubris, about the dangers of assuming safety without rigorous evidence, about the consequences when corporate interests align against public health. But it is also a testament to what reform can achieve when tragedy forces a reckoning. The modern pharmaceutical regulatory system, with all its complexity and its costs, exists because of thalidomide. The requirement that drugs be proven both safe and effective, the structured phases of clinical trials, the emphasis on informed consent, these emerged from the recognition that the old system had failed catastrophically. Francis Kelsey's story reminds us that individual integrity matters, that one person doing their job properly can make a difference, that resistance to pressure and insistence on standards serve purposes far greater than bureaucratic procedure. She did not have the benefit of hindsight when she questioned the Kevadon application. She had only her training, her experience with the sulfanilamide tragedy decades earlier, and her conviction that claims must be supported by evidence. Those were enough. The survivors remind us that behind every regulatory decision, behind every drug approval or denial, are human lives, real people, real families, real consequences that extend across lifetimes. The statistics are staggering. 10,000 to 20,000 affected children, 46 countries, decades of suffering. But each number represents an individual, a child who should have been born whole, a family that should have been spared this grief, a life that should have unfolded differently. The questions thalidomide raised have never been fully answered. How do we balance innovation with caution? What level of testing is sufficient? How do we ensure that the systems designed to protect public health remain vigilant across generations when memories fade and the pressure to move quickly, to approve faster, to compete globally, constantly reasserts itself? How do we hold corporations accountable when harm occurs despite regulations, or because regulations were insufficient? These are not merely historical questions. They echo in every debate about drug approval timelines, about the cost of regulation, about the proper role of government oversight. The thalidomide tragedy teaches us that the cost of inadequate caution can be measured in ruined lives, that moving too quickly can produce disasters that no amount of compensation can remedy, that trust once broken is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The white crystalline powder still exists. Under controlled conditions, administered with extensive safeguards, it helps some patients today. The irony is inescapable. The drug that caused one of medicine's greatest catastrophes now saves lives. But this paradox only reinforces the central lesson. Context matters, knowledge matters, and most of all, memory matters. In every warning label on a medication, in every informed consent form, in every clinical trial protocol, the echo of thalidomide persists. The legacy lives in the heightened awareness of teratogenic risks, in the caution with which physicians prescribe to pregnant women, in the entire infrastructure of drug safety that emerged from the ashes of that tragedy. The story of thalidomide is not merely about a drug or a disaster. It is about the obligation we owe to one another, to test thoroughly, to question claims, to demand proof, to resist pressure when safety hangs in the balance, to remember that behind every medical decision are human beings whose lives may be forever altered by choices made in laboratories and boardrooms and regulatory offices. The children born with sealed limbs and absent arms, with malformed organs and shattered futures, carry that lesson in their bodies. The 3,000 survivors who remain, aging now, facing new challenges, as bodies worn by decades of compensation begin to fail. They are the living archive of what happens when we forget, when we cut corners, when we trust without verifying, when we allow profit to trump precaution. May we never forget. May the systems built in response to this tragedy remain strong. May each generation of physicians, regulators, researchers, and pharmaceutical executives understand that their decisions carry weight beyond quarterly earnings, beyond approval timelines, beyond competitive advantage. May they remember the amber bottles, the white powder, the promises of complete safety, and the 10,000 children who paid the price for those promises. And with that, we conclude this exploration into one of medicine's darkest chapters. The lesson endures. The vigilance must continue. The memory must not fade. Good night.